Let me begin by introducing LSE Alumni China Forum. It was founded in 2015 by LSE alumni with a focus on China's economic, social, and cultural development. We seek to construct a platform for guests from all walks of life to interact with the world's leading scholars and leaders. This year, we are going to hold an offline forum in Shanghai, China in the coming September, so make sure to follow our social media accounts and check it out. Also, we are organizing online panels with a focus on a range of political and economic issues, as the one we've held on April the 16th with Professor Wang Genwu. This online panel is our fourth virtual event, and today we are more than delighted to have Professor Danny Quah joining us. Professor Quah is staying a Li Ka-shing professor at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in National University of Singapore. He also worked as the director of the Southway Hawk Southeast Asia Center at LSE, and he had also served as LSE head of Department for Economics and council members on Malaysia's National Economic Advisory Council. In addition, he worked as an associate professor of economics at MIT before. His research interests include income inequality, economic growth, and international economic relations. Professor Quah's current research takes an economic approach to world order, with focus on global power shift and the rise of the East. One measure that Professor Quah approaches the topic of international system that I personally found really innovative is the application of supply and demand in studying world order. So on one hand, we have what international system the world's superpowers provide, and on the other hand, we have what world order the global community needs. But we may come back to this later. And we are honored to have him here today to share his insights on the Sino-US relations under Biden's administration, as well as how the relations will influence the rest of the world. Unfortunately, Professor Chris Alden is unable to join us here today due to some personal reasons, but he kindly sent us his regards. So as for the agenda today, Professor Quah will take 15 minutes to share his views, and then we will have a 20-minute discussion. After that, we will open the floor and have a 20-minute Q&A session. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Professor Quah.
Thank you, Cici, and good day, everyone. I hope you are hearing me okay, that the microphone is on and everybody is hearing my voice. Okay, good. Excellent, thank you. It is wonderful to get to be back at LSE, as it were. I spent many years there. Among the most enjoyable times I had at LSE were actually when I was representing LSE in Beijing at the summer school we used to organize together with Peking University. And we used to go there every year to teach in the summer school there. That was one of the most enjoyable and professionally fruitful times that I got to have at LSE. This session, this evening, is of course happening under less happy times in terms of the relations between China and the rest of the world, or in particular, Sino-US relations. They are, those relations, Sino-US relations have now plummeted to the worst they have been for more than 4 decades. The world has seen 4 years of a Trump administration and now has transitioned to a Biden administration. And as the title for this session suggests, what you and I are here to talk about is what this transition means for Sino-US relations and for the rest of the world. So I want to begin just putting down some facts that I see from where I sit now. I now live in Singapore. I moved to the Lee Kuan Yew School and the National University of Singapore about 4 years ago after a long time at the London School of Economics. And I think that I speak not just for myself, but for many observers around the world, outside the United States in particular, we remember the Trump administration's time as being a divisive time. Put aside how it must have seemed to Americans themselves, I'm just speaking from the perspective of those of us in the rest of the world. The Trump administration seemed divisive. It did not seek to put the world together. It seemed confrontational. It disrespected allies. It disrespected long-standing alliances. Sometimes it approached foreign relations with China and with many other countries around the world with what seemed to be like an end of days zeal, the feeling that that there was no good future ahead already. Otherwise, it was injected with Trump's willful randomness, because Trump injected a great deal of uncertainty into foreign relations. US-China relations, yes, but into relations with a lot of the rest of the world. When this changed with the presidential election at the end of last year, I think many of us around the world thought that the new Biden presidency would restore the international community to how it used to be. What I want to report on is actually that does not seem to be the case. Yes, the new Biden presidency brings visions of America once again taking leadership in the world. But whether that is good or bad, I think remains to be seen. Biden has approached COVID-19 in a different way than Trump. He has rejoined the global climate agreement. He has turned back America's withdrawal from the World Health Organization. But on a number of other dimensions, I think we still need to wait and see how this administration turns out to be different from the Trump administration. Now, at first, that might seem quite a controversial position to take, because isn't it like night and day? Well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. So I want to speak about this, first to talk about some facts on why I, for one, but others as well, have this mixed view of the Biden presidency and administration relative to Trump's. But also I want to talk about some long-standing issues that affect how we should be thinking about the Biden presidency and how its impact on Sino-US relations and on the rest of the world will potentially emerge. So let me just begin with some facts, just to get to this Trump-Biden discussion. Clearly, Trump was very sharply focused, and his personal view on Sino-US relations, you could collapse to just a single issue. That single issue was the trade balance. The reason Trump was so incensed by China's bilateral trade surplus against the United States was he had gotten into a way of speaking to his base, his followers, the people who supported him, in terms of identifying America's bilateral trade deficit with somehow the idea that from that trade deficit, America was losing. All the gold, all the money was leaving America because of the trade deficit. It was all piling up in China, and America was losing. That was Trump's agenda. He kept to that as far as Sino-US relations were concerned, and he kept to that in his personal engagement, because that's what would have kept his presidency going. But he did not keep the rest of his administration from going a little bit full court press against China. So the plummeting of Sino-US relations was magnified, not just from the Trump presidency itself, but from his administration, the public servants around him, defense officials, his Secretary of State, his trade advisors. Well, trade goes back to his focus on trade balance, but his advisors generally. So what are some examples of this? Well, in 2018, the US National Defense Strategy switched. It switched from what it had been ever since 9/11, when its focus was the war on terror, to a new focus, great power competition. 2018 marked a change in how America talked about its national defense strategy, from war on terror to great power competition. And for great power competition, you can pretty much read into that shorthand for Sino-US relations. So the new narrative that Trump's administration, maybe not Trump himself, but Trump's administration, with Trump not doing anything to hold them back, was something like this. China had become strategic competitor to the United States. And this is language, the next few words I'm going to say is language that comes right out of the US National Defense Strategy. China is a strategic competitor now, and China uses predatory economics to intimidate others around the world. In the view of those running this defense strategy, China was a revisionist power that sought to shape a new world order consistent with, and again, this is language from that strategy, consistent with China's own authoritarian model. China sought to pursue veto power over the economic, diplomatic, and security decisions of their neighbors. So what for Trump was a narrow focus on the US bilateral trade deficit, something that economists and many other observers had very little time for because they did not buy into that story that if you run a trade deficit, you are losing. Very few economists bought into that. But from there, Trump allowed officials in the administration to run rampant over this larger landscape, a landscape that began to demonize China. It was across the board confrontation potential. Let me quickly say, from the outside, observing from the outside, yes, America was a great shock to the system, but China's actions, incorrectly interpreted or otherwise, did not help. Because what China did allowed America to ring its alarm bells even more loudly. What are some of those examples? Whatever the reality, from the outside, China's treatment of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, never mind, let me be very clear, never mind that America itself has its own challenges with instability due to terrorism, due to international terrorism. But never mind that, America was quite willing to read this treatment, whatever its reality, a setting of alarm bells. And other alarm bells, which from the perspective of China and maybe from other observers seem reasonable, in the light of this new defense strategy, in light of this American mood, set off all other kinds of alarm bells. National security law in Hong Kong, the 9-dash line in the South China Sea, disputed territories, re-landscaping, what for other observers was the building of military territories. Again, whatever the reality on islands in the South China Sea, this set off all other kinds of alarm bells. And the two sides were never able to deal with each other in a sensible way, in a way that talked out these issues. And then on top of all that, for reasons of his own in dealing with the corruption challenges in China, Xi Jinping ended up consolidating power and extending or removing term limits. And again, that set off alarm bells from an America that, given this narrative that was echoing in everybody's ears, was already not going to take any of this well. Whatever the reasons for this, I'm not taking sides in this, I'm just saying this is how the observations came out. Because at the end of this all, my next fact, Donald Trump thought that Xi Jinping was a great guy. He had no personal issues with Xi Jinping. Donald Trump himself referred to the Uyghur camps in Xinjiang as the right thing to do. So from America, from the Trump administration, there came this very peculiar message to the rest of the world. Donald Trump, who was the great disruptor, had his views, but he allowed an administration that went full court press on setting off alarm bells on many things that China was doing. So in all of that, we had 4 years of this disruption. Then when Biden came in as president, he seemed at first to do the right thing. We joined the Paris Agreement on climate change, working with China on climate change issues, halting the US withdrawal from the World Health Organization. All of that seemed to be right. The US has come back into the world in a predictable way without Trump's randomness and uncertainty and disorganization. Biden was recognizing allies, acknowledging longstanding alliances. And at the same time as he did all this, it is also Biden, not Donald Trump, who, citing liberal values, multiple times told the world how he thinks Xi Jinping doesn't have a single democratic bone in his body. This is a very peculiar state of the world, with administrations on the one hand seeming to do the right thing and then the president going in the opposite direction. The Trump transition to Biden, let me just summarize this collection of facts. The Trump transition to Biden is not going to be the night and day kind of transition. Because at the end of it all, there is real politics at work. We have to remember that in the 2020 elections, 74 million Americans voted for Donald Trump. Yes, Trump lost, but 74 million Americans who voted for him means that more Americans voted for Donald Trump just a few months ago than voted for Barack Obama in 2008. And those 74 million Americans, if they share one thing with the Americans who voted for Joe Biden, they all agree that China is a rival that dangerously threatens the position of the US in the world. A position that at number one, they greatly value for themselves. So at the end of all this sort of circulation of facts, what do we have? We have, on the one hand, Trump's random willfulness, that where there was a good personal chemistry, but an administration that seemed to set off alarm bells and did all the most dangerous things. Donald Trump. Joe Biden still has to respect all of those Americans who consider China a great rival. Joe Biden, whose administration does some things well, but Joe Biden, who seems to have no personal chemistry with China's leadership. And at the end of this all, neither of these, Donald Trump or Joe Biden, would, in the views of most international relations scholars, be considered great internationalists. People who think about the world and America's place in the world, in the sense of, well, great American presidents like Woodrow Wilson, who might have been a racist in America, but tried to do the right things in the world. Harry Truman or Richard Nixon. All of these presidents had challenges with the American people, but they all tried to make the world a better place. So that is the position that we're in. And I think it's a very dangerous position. Do I have any good news? One thing you might say is, wait, hang on, all of this talk that I'm giving so far, it's all international relations and politics. Aren't I supposed to be an economist? Where is the economic analysis that the great decoupling is not going to be possible, that the value chain and supply chains that we've built mean that America and China cannot continue on this worsening of relations? Okay, let me turn now, put on my hat as an economist, because if what I just described is the way the world has been for the last 4 years and potentially for the next 8 years, what was the world like before? Why was there a time when I and my colleagues from the LSE and American scholars were constantly in Beijing talking about building new bridges, talking about building new collaborations. There was a world before Donald Trump. What was that world like? And how should we think about the longer term changes that brought us from that previous world to the current one, where a great deal of the American population no longer seems to understand that there have been huge benefits to themselves and to the world, to global stability, peace, and prosperity from this very strong bringing together of the world's two most powerful nations, the US and China. Where has that world gone? Okay, so this is where I want to spend the next few minutes of. I mean, the organizers have been kind enough to tell me you can take a little bit more than the time we originally allocated you, which will have run out by now. But let me say a little bit about a background to why I am optimistic, despite all these terrible things that are happening. And the reason I'm optimistic, yes, it is economics, but not economics in the sense of production chains and global supply chains, but economics in the sense that nations and people, at the end of it all, have to make rational choices. At the end of it all, what nations and people do is make choices based on what is best for themselves, not on emotion, not on habit, not on constructivist psychological fear-mongering, but based on rational calculations about what's good for themselves. And in that kind of a world, if we can restore that rationality, the world will come to its senses, and we need to rebuild better US-China relations, because that will be good for the world. So what I want to do in the time that I've got left is cover four things. I'm going to quickly describe to you two background hypotheses that take an economics perspective on this terrible situation that we're in. And then I'm going to make one suggestion to both sides, US and China, and actually to everybody else. I'm going to make one suggestion. And then the fourth thing I'm going to do is make a wild conjecture about what the new international order might look like coming out of this. Okay, so these four things, the first two background hypotheses are, I want to run quickly through what is really at stake in this contest. The things that Trump articulated, the things that his administration expressed, I want to put to one side and ask what is really at stake in the world. What is the sense to calling the other great power in the world names? Why are you doing this name calling? What is really at stake in this contest? The second background hypothesis I want to cover is why understanding what is really at stake in this contest matters for the world, for the United States, for China, but also for everybody else in the world. Because at the end of it, remember, the two great powers, US and China, are hugely consequential, but 80% of the world's people live in neither the United States nor China. What does this 80% do? How does this 80% make sure that the world comes out okay for them? My suggestion that I would whisper in everybody's ear confidentially, here's how to win the competition. Here's how to win. And then finally, I'm going to talk about the new international order. Okay, so those are the four things I'd like to cover in the time I've got available. What is the background to this real contest? I'm going to set out two possibilities. The first possibility is that, yes, there is a great geostrategic rivalry. There is a real contest here. That real contest, however, is not between the United States and China. Instead, it is simply a grand competition to see who is number one in the world. By this, I mean the identities of the players are irrelevant. Obviously, they have to be great powers to be number one in the world. You have to be the most powerful nation. You have to put is number two great power in Czech. That has to be the case. But it doesn't matter that it's the US and China. In an earlier time, it was the United Kingdom and France. In a different part of the world, it was Russia and Japan. The identities don't matter. The geostrategic rivalry is just to see who is number one. Irrelevant also in this who is number one narrative is what stories we use to justify this position of antagonism and confrontation. This time, at this point in 2021 in world history, yes, those key players happen to be China and the United States, and the narratives happen to be like the ones I recited to you earlier. They circle around who's pushing the rule of law, who is saying we need to be accountable, who's pushing open systems versus criticisms of hypocrisy, double standards, illegitimacy because of failure in performance. Those are just narratives. What matters is the competition for who is number one. That's one view. And in that view, and there are many scholars who think that that's the right view, in that view, the US and China, they're just stand-ins for what is just the great confrontation in all human international confrontation, in all human international relations. Of course, the other view is that, no, that's completely wrong. It is absolutely essential that we are talking about China and the United States, that there's something unique and inevitable in the civilizational construct of these two great nations. It is those civilizational constructs, those uniquenesses that make for today's fraught relations. Whether those uniquenesses are what? Liberal values versus social values. Different political systems, political meritocracy versus wild electioneering. Is it a cultural issue? Does it have to do with race? Does it have to do with religion? All of these are possibilities, but these are all possibilities that focus in on the specific identity of China, specific identity of the US. Now, many of you are students in economics or related field at the London School of Economics, and you might say, which of these two views makes economic sense? Neither of these do. I mean, how could it be important who is number one in the world? No matter what international history says, you can't eat being number one. Being number one doesn't give you something nice to drink. But its economic analysis is actually being number one gives you an option value. That option value means you get to write the rules of the game if you are top dog. So this US-China confrontation, who is going to be number one? Whether America is doing everything it can to encircle and restrict China, whether China's rise is threatening the United States. If this is all about being number one, it's all about striving for that option value, for writing the rules of the international game that then determine how other nations have to behave. It's no longer just a question of my competing with you, is that we get to compete. And then after that, I get to write the rules of the game. Of course, coming with writing the rules of the game, it is a benefit, but there's also a cost. And that's the cost of leadership. Because to continue being the leader, being top dog, being number one, you, whoever you are, you need to attract legitimacy and the consent of the governed. You need to show that you deserve to be number one, whether through your great military power or through your excellence in delivering prosperity to your people, being effortlessly attractive and appealing in your culture, serving as security officer for the world wherever conflict might emerge, and most important, that you can provide global public goods, that you can take the right stance on the global environment, that you are able to deal with a global pandemic. All of these things are the costs and benefits of being number one. And there's a way of thinking that says that this competition for who is going to be number one is actually almost feral. It is wild in nature. John Mearsheimer, the great political scientist at the University of Chicago, his way of thinking about this great power competition is called offensive realism. And in the IR students among you will, of course, recognize this already. Economic students might not, because it's not something that we learn. But in Mearsheimer's view, being number one is how you maximize your probability of survival. Every nation seeks to optimize its prospects for survival. So whether you are China or the United States in this current confrontation, or Russia and Japan at earlier time, you are simply following what the Mearsheimer model says you do. You want to be number one. That competition is tragic, but it is inevitable because every nation seeks to optimize its prospects for survival. Now, I'm happy in question and answer to take us through a discussion of what this competition for number one, performance legitimacy, costs and benefits of leadership means in terms of trade, technology, COVID-19, combating global poverty, global climate change in general. I'm happy to come back to all of that. But that's the landscape of the battleground, abstracting away from the name calling that's going on. Let me turn to my second background description. So my first hypothesis is that it is the battle between being number one, battle for being number one that matters. And it just so happens that the identities of being of number one, number two right now happen to be situated between the G2, US and China. And that's why Sino-US competition is as frenetic as it is. Let me turn to the consequences of this, why this competition matters. Why do I think that thinking about things this way, rather than the way that we see described in newspapers, is important? Because what I've just described is something that as economic students, we can get a handle on, that international relations students will already recognize the different ways in which this is put together. I might give a more economic description than they like, but it's still the same model. Why does this matter? This matters because the great power competition, rivalry, whatever its source, is between the G2, but as I said just a few minutes ago, 80% of the world lives in neither the United States nor China. And how this competition comes out matters. And it doesn't just matter to the US and China. It matters to the great majority of, it matters to the world. It matters to the great majority of the world because the great majority of the world right now seems to stand outside of this great power competition. They do not figure when Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, used to stand up and criticize China. They do not figure when China criticizes America for its failure in delivering economic benefits to its own people. But this competition matters to the rest of the world. Now, how does the rest of the world figure this? Why should the rest of the world matter? Because there's actually a hugely respected strand of thinking in international relations that says these small states, meaning actually everybody in the world except US and China, these small states don't matter. How can 80% of the world not matter? Well, I cite two authoritative sources. The first is the great political scientist and professor at Harvard, who in 1979, when I was still a student, he wrote, Kenneth Waltz, this great Harvard political scientist, Kenneth Waltz wrote, well, it would be ridiculous to construct a theory of international politics based on small states like Malaysia or like Costa Rica. It would be as ridiculous to do that as to construct an economic theory of oligopolistic competition based on only the minor firms in the economy. Why look at the small firms? We should be looking at the number one and number two. Kenneth Waltz described that was the way we should be studying international politics, that great power competition of the kind that I'm describing is the way of the world. But when Kenneth Waltz wrote this in 1979, he was actually simply channeling someone who had written this 2,000 years earlier than him. everyone now knows about Thucydides in the Thucydides trap, because what I just described, many people might recognize as being the main, one of the building blocks of Graham Allison, the Harvard Kennedy School professor who wrote a book called The Thucydides Trap, where he said two nations, two great powers that are in contention with each other, more often than not, high probability will go into confrontation with each other. Thucydides, this Greek historian, did talk about the challenge of competition between Athens and Sparta, which is the basis for what we now know as the Thucydides trap. But he also wrote other things, something that I call, in some things I've written, the Thucydides fallacy. What Thucydides wrote is, the strong do what they will, the weak suffer what they must. It is only the great powers that matter. Everybody else is like the small animals that get trampled on when elephants fight each other. The strong do what they will, the weak suffer what they must. Part of my research these days is an attempt to examine that hypothesis. I think that's an open research question, whether in the real world today, small states actually have agency to affect the great powers. One of the examples I've studied recently is how small states around the Soviet Union during the Cold War were actually able to get their way against the wishes of the Soviet Union. As an economist, as an econometrician, what I'm trying to estimate is the numerical value of the elasticity in great power position in response to small states' agency. And that elasticity is finite. Okay. And there is shift in great power position when small states do act. But today, what you and I are discussing is, what were the small states doing before all of this competition came about? Now here is the genius of America. And it is why America won for so long. It's also why I think America is unable to maintain its winning position. The great genius of America, when it built the international system, where it was acknowledged to be the leader, something that political scientists like Joe Nye call the American century. That great genius was that America was the most powerful nation in the world, but it allowed small states to think that they mattered. America allowed small states to think that they mattered to America. That was the genius of the so-called American century. It is why America is the repository of soft power, by allowing others to think that they matter. So this genius of the American century built the world's multilateral, rules-based international order. And what America provided in the American century is like a laundry list of what small states love. No wonder America continued to attract soft power. America proposed a model of multilateralism. No single state or group of states would just run the world. Everybody had a say. It made the world, it made that international order seem inclusive, seem transparent. It made it seem fair with clear principles. There was a level playing field. America made economic prosperity seem to be the goal and achievable for everyone, every nation, provided only they played by the rules. Outcomes will be determined by rule of law, not the arbitrary exercise of power. America, the world's most powerful nation, sat back and said, okay, that's the law, we'll obey it. There was organized provision of global public goods. Now, when I say America was genius in doing this, I'm not saying that America actually did all of this. I'm not saying that America did not disrespect small states and waved them aside when it came to America's interest. I said it was genius because America made everybody think that those small states mattered. So this gets me to finishing up my talk now. I've got by my watch 10 minutes left. Cece, if I'm running over time, please just give a shout. But okay, so I've got a little bit under 10 minutes. Let me tell you now my last two messages. The first of these, how to win. And then the last of these is my wild conjecture on what the world will look like. So how to win? America, for the last 70 years, showed us how to win. Create a system that makes small states feel like they are respected. So will whoever wins the world going forwards win it through banging head-on, great power, Kenneth Waltz, Thucydides fallacy type competition? Should America take on China? Should China take on the United States and then by doing that win over the rest of the world? No. No one's going to win over the rest of the world through direct confrontation with your great rival. The winning strategies that have worked in the 20th century, and arguably for the first time ever in all of human history, were winning strategies devised by great American presidents like Harry Truman, who said, Harry Truman talking to Henry Kissinger, after the Second World War, we totally defeated our enemies. Nazi Germany was no longer even a thing. We defeated Japan. But after defeating Germany and Japan, defeating all our enemies, we brought them back to the community of nations. As Henry Kissinger put it, Truman was conscious of America's vast power, but he took pride, Truman did. Truman took pride above all in America's humane and democratic values. Truman wanted to be remembered not so much for America's victories as for his conciliations. 2 decades after that, Richard Nixon wrote, as he was approaching China through a reconciliation after confrontation following the Communist Revolution and the Korean War. Richard Nixon wrote, we America, cannot afford to leave China outside the family of nations, there to nurture its fantasies, cherish its hates, threaten its neighbors. There is no place on this small planet for 1 billion of the world's potentially most able people to live in angry isolation. That's what Richard Nixon wrote on the eve of the great political normalization between the US and China. And following that, America opened up to China. China opened up to America. The understanding on the exchange of students and scholars, things that brought, people like you and me into the West. It brought hundreds of thousands of Chinese students to the United States, raising interpersonal understanding, increasing trust through collaboration, helping all of these Chinese students understand better what America was like, and in turn, helping America understand what China was like. That seems to me a really good way to think about winning the world. Here's another way that I would whisper. Think about win-win development. Think about infrastructure and mutual economic prosperity. Speak about pragmatism, not universalism. Bring everyone on board with you on this journey. So if I were to suggest to anybody in the world what would win the world, it is this making other people think that they are valued. So I'm coming to the end of this. I've got 5 minutes left, I hope, Cece. So what do I think the new international order will look like? I think there are a number of possibilities. One is the old system, it worked. Participating in that system, allowing China to trade to grow to economic prosperity, brought 650 million Chinese out of extreme poverty, continues to propel the growth of China's poorest people ever upwards, continues to bring huge prosperity in trade to, well, the other 80% of the world, all the other nations around the world. So how should I describe that? Rules-based multilateralism, with or without American leadership. It has long been assumed that only America could build that system. I don't think that's so clear anymore. Trump, Biden, the anger of the American people to the rest of the world. I mean, it might be China in America's sights now, but their rhetoric and their anger in terms of losing economic supremacy can be applied to anyone. One day it might be applied to the United Kingdom, where so many of you are sitting. If the United Kingdom gets its economic act even better together. But there are all other possibilities. For so long, we have thought about leadership in the world, the international order, as being associated with a single hegemon, whether a benevolent leader or not so benevolent leader, but single nation leadership. We need to get away from thinking about that. Why do we want the leader of the world, we want the one who organizes the world, provides global public goods to do many things. Think hard about repairing global climate change, regulate financial markets so they are unstable, be the world's police officer so that if rogue states break the law and attack their own people, we have recourse to that. But in the last 70 years, we have thought about all of this as being the responsibility of just a single nation. And that's why, think about it in a single nation, we think about this as being a US-China competition. Why do we think the world needs a single leader? Put it a little bit differently. If we want a leader to take care of all of these challenges, and you're worried about financial market instability, worried about global security, why do you need an aircraft carrier to regulate financial markets? Why do you have to have the same nation have all the aircraft carriers as the one we give leadership to in terms of financial market regulation? We can think about different geometries of international order, and not all of those are the same. Not all of those have a single leader, but all the good ones have a way in which there's a level playing field, everybody gains, everybody is included in the system. Let me finish. Do I have a preferred system from all of this? My research and writing now is about alternative world orders. I try and imagine in an economics way what alternative world orders might look like, and then I place that in a marketplace. I can put that in a marketplace where there's supply of world order and demand for world order. And the transactions of the world determine the market clearing, equilibrium, optimum world order. That new international order will have different nations undertaking different tasks, different provisions. There's a place for small states. Expertise in regulating in fintech does not come from being just a large nation. It comes from expertise. And Singapore, as well as China, could well provide such expertise. It does not have to be the United States. There are different tasks and functions in this new world order. And there's a clear role for the provision of global public goods. I've reached the end of this time I've gotten to speak to you about these ideas. I've greatly enjoyed myself talking. I'm looking forward to the Q&A. But let me repeat, I've done 4 things. I've talked about, well, first I began with some facts about Trump and Biden to say that it wasn't so clear that this Trump-Biden transition is going to lead to a clearing up of the Sino-US relations. And I talked about how there are 2 background hypotheses to why this is happening. One, why this is happening, the competition for who is number 1. Second, why it matters for the world. And then I've tried to give some hints to potential world leaders among you about how to win the world. And then I've talked about what I think a good new international order would look like. Now, I've reached the end of my time, CC, so I'm going to turn back to you, and I look forward to my conversation with you as well as to all of the audience who are here. Thank you all very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very educational speech, Professor Quah. And before we open the floor to accept any questions, Professor Quah, let's proceed to a moderated discussion. And I will let my colleague Jackson to ask his question. Jackson?
Hi, Jackson. Good to see you.
Yeah, hi, Professor. Actually, my question came from my conversation with Dr. Lan Ping from the East Asian Institute. So when we talk about your analysis of supply and demand, he pointed out that one of the problems that China faces now is that the world demand more than just economic assistance or like investments. But the problem with China now is that the only thing that China can supply is its economic power. Unlike the United States can export its values, its systems, its political system, democracy, all that. But when the world look at China, Dr. Lan said that even Pakistan is is on a very good term with China, but Pakistan wouldn't want communism. Pakistan have to say that we embrace democracy, although they arguably might not be a genuine democracy. So do you foresee that this to be a really big problem for China? And what do you think that China can do to help it? Because China tried to export its culture through those Confucius schools, but it's not working well now. So what do you have to say on this?
Yeah, thank you, Jackson. That's an excellent question. Thank you very much. Maybe before I take the heart of your question, let me expand a little bit as well. For a long time, IR scholars would say, China might be a leader of the world, but it's not willing, it's not volunteering to step up to do that. Often China talks about itself as all of you know much better than I do. China talks about itself as a developing economy still. And it is not the position of a developing economy to provide all of these goods to the rest of the world. That's also why, So before that's the China's continues to be a developing economy. In some of its technology, of course, it is now a world leader, and for the first time in human history, a developing country is, a global leader in so many interesting areas of advanced technology. But at the same time that it is all that, it does not pretend to provide everything to the people. The Chinese people, from my observations, have a lot of individual freedom and a lot of agency. The government has a lot of agency, but there's a huge gap in the middle of civil society that has not yet fully formed, that we think about as being a characteristic of developed countries. China, it seems to me, is fully aware of all of this. So exactly as you say, as other IR scholars have said, China is either not in a position and not volunteering and not pushing itself forward as a leader of the world. Many of you will know that when China talks about how it practices such and such socialism with Chinese characteristics, it means that is something that works for it. It doesn't intend that these be exported to the rest of the world. So exactly as you say, Jackson, China doesn't provide any of this. But my model of supply and demand does not insist that China be the provider of everything. In fact, my model is precisely one that says we should stop thinking about suppliers as being a supplier of everything that we want. A supplier in a marketplace is a supplier of food, is a supplier of blue jeans, is a supplier of computers. They supply a single commodity. So too should China, should America, should the United Kingdom, should Singapore supply to the world the things that it has a comparative advantage in, not try to be a one-stop shop for everything. So the China-Pakistan example is a good one. If China can provide the infrastructure, the building, the engineering know-how that advances Pakistan's economy, Pakistan should feel free to go shop elsewhere for the elements of civil society that it wants to build. It does not have to be just China that provides that. The mistake I think the world made for the last 70 years is because America was so powerful in so many dimensions. All our thinking was, we need something, we go to America for it. America provided everything. And that the way the world is now shows a weakness of that model. So I don't think of it as a shortcoming in the supply and demand marketplace model, that a country like China cannot supply everything about world order. What I think of it as is that marketplace model guides us to thinking that China should not be trying to supply everything, just as America should also not be trying to supply everything to the world. Thank you for your question.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And Professor, so I actually got a question. So you previously mentioned that Biden is setting all of these moral standards in treating China and accusing China of ignoring democracy and liberalism. And I actually watched your TED talk earlier, from which I am really inspired. And in your TED talk, you talk about how democracy is not about ballot box, and it is more about the government being constructed on the flowing sands of people's will. Then in this case, isn't it self-contradictory for U.S. to claim to be this dominant force of democracy, or you think in political discourse what's on the paper is more important, and what's on the surface makes a clearer voice instead of the core value of country embodied?
Thank you so much, Cici. That's a wonderful question. Thank you so much, and thank you for referring to my earlier TED talk, which I still believe, because sometimes we say things and then a few years after we think, oh no, that was wrong. No, I still firmly believe that, and how it's consistent with what we're talking about today. See, in the American Declaration of Independence, when America declared itself independent of Great Britain, actually, it said in there that the government should serve with the consent of the governed. The government should serve only as long as the people that it governs agree to that government serving. And in the hundreds of years since then, America has viewed that to mean ballot box elections. Okay. But of course, in a ballot box election, there is no guarantee that the people actually end up being served by the government. Whereas in a system that is responsive to the people, whether it is an authoritarian state or officially a democratic state, but a state that is responsive to what the people want, builds in this idea of responsiveness. So let's look at America, ballot box elections. How does America's people consent to the system of government that they've got? America's bottom 50% of the population are poorer today than they were 3 decades ago. China's bottom 50% of the population are 6 times richer today than they were 30 years ago. Right? Who has actually served the people? America's infrastructure is crumbling. America, through the COVID-19 pandemic, killed over 500,000 of its own people. More Americans died in the coronavirus pandemic than died in World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War combined. That is not a government that attracts consent of the governed, no matter how much it claims ballot box democracy gives its government legitimacy. Of course, on the other side, if we don't have some mechanism that allows the government to be thrown out or modified or adjusted, then it is also dangerous because we see examples around the world where authoritarian governments steal from their people, allow corruption to run through their state, immiserize their people. Not all authoritarian governments are responsive, just as not all democratic governments attract consent of the governed, actually serve their people. So I would say, relative to that TED talk that I gave, I continue to stand by it, that the world is much more complicated than simply a division between democracy and authoritarianism. But that simple-minded, simplistic division continues to be the way many American liberals talk about relations with the rest of the world. It's extremely unfortunate, but they continue to do that. So I think your question is one that we need to be constantly talking to our fellow citizens, everybody around us, to remind ourselves of what governments are supposed to do. Like you say, they need to feel that they are on shifting sands of their citizens' approvals. They need to continue to attract the consent of the governed. They need to be responsive to their citizenry, and they've got to figure out mechanisms by which they do that. The ballot box is not a perfect mechanism, nor is pure authoritarianism. Thank you, Cici.
Thank you so much, Professor. So despite I still have, though I still have many questions ready, I noticed that in our chat box, there are many insightful questions that are ready to be answered. So shall we just open the floor? And before we do any questions, I have to say that everyone feel free to type out your questions in the chat box or raise your hands. And I noticed that some of you don't have that function in your Zoom setting, but that's okay. You can give a thumbs up emoji, just like this, and we will call you and unmute you to ask the questions. And remember, please try to keep your question concise, and please remember, before the question, introduce yourself briefly. So I will wait a few seconds to see if anyone would like to raise questions. Okay, so before anyone raise their hands, I will select some question from our chat box. Okay, so Professor George Chen asked that, do you think the current Sino-US economic rivalry is in a way similar to the previous challenges to US, for example, Japan and Western Europe during the 1970s? And if yes, to what extent?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Cici, and thank you, George, for that excellent question. I might also extend it to other challenges to America's place as leader in the world, from the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and actually not so much challenges to America's supremacy in the world, but challenges to America's authority by small states like Nicaragua during the Somoza period. So let me take these in turn. America also went through a period of worry about the economic challenge from the East in the early 1980s, from the rise of Japan. And America worried about that so much that that some of America's top elites decided that they needed to understand Japan better. They couldn't criticize Japan for being not a democracy, because it was a democracy that America had built in Japan after the Second World War. So that option was not available to the American narrative. But they did worry that the rise of Japan meant the rise of a non-Western, non-Christian, non-English speaking other state. And because of this, they built structures that brought about greater communication between Japan and the West. the trilateral committee itself, grouping that brought together the United States, Western Europe, and Japan, brought their top business and political elites together into constant conversation with each other. And all of that worked. It made Japan more known to the West. And in fact, things got to a point where many in the developing world, when I was growing up in Southeast Asia, began to think of Japan as no longer Asian. Japan was as Western Europe and the United States. But of course, very unfortunately, that was not the end of the story, because Japan's rise, together with an emerging bubble in Japanese stock market, in Japanese assets, in Japanese housing, and then a disruption due to an adjustment of the Japanese yen, led to a serious disruption in the Japanese growth trajectory. By then, of course, Japan was already a first world nation. Its per capita income matched that of the United States and Western Europe. So the parallel, as it were, is that here is another rise of a non-Western, non-English speaking, non-Christian nation from elsewhere in the world, except that this other nation now has learned the lessons from Japanese history. It will not be drawn into the kind of disruption. China will not be drawn in the kind of disruption that ensued after the Plaza Accord on the Japanese currency. And at this point, China remains a developing country. China's per capita income, not total income, China's per capita income remains well below that of advanced Western nations. There's a lot of upside growth trajectory still in China's growth path. So I think there are similarities and there are differences. The Soviet Union was in a competition with the United States, yes, for economic supremacy, but also on political ideology and also on ways to think about how to organize economic production. China seeks to do none of the latter. China is as bound to the marketplace as America is. China is bound to the rules of economic competition as America says that it is. So we see that America, when it loses, tries to change the rules. China does not seek to have a universalist vision from where I sit, from where I stand, from all the things that I read. China does not seek to be in a position where it imposes its political organization on anywhere else in the world. A few minutes ago, I made a joke about how when China thinks about socialism with Chinese characteristics, what it really means and what the rest of the world doesn't understand is that this is something that works for China. It's not meant to work for the rest of the world. Right now, the only player in this game that thinks that they have something that works for the rest of the world is America. America seeks a universalist vision of how other nations run their political systems. China does not. This was not the case in the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. The Soviet Union's ultimate collapse showed the bankruptcy of ideas and their alternative ways of organizing economic activity, and China is not falling in the same trap. So I think, George, yours is an excellent question. There are many things to say about this. I've gone over just two examples, the Soviet Union and Japan. Let me, if I may, leave it at that, unless you have a quick comeback. I think you seem to have to, but I also want to give others a chance. So over to you, George. I don't know if you can unmute yourself or.
Just a second. Our colleague is.
Or perhaps you can write out your question and CC can read to me.
Hi, can you
hear you now?
Thank you so much, Professor. I think perhaps it is also linked to my another question, is that I wonder whether, for example, this kind of not as the Chinese model, not as socialism, but as this kind of developmental economy, like East Asian model of South Korea and perhaps Japan and Singapore maybe become a model competition and spread to the rest of the world. So it's more like not a Sino-US rivalry, but a developmentalist model versus the liberal democratic and neoliberal free market capitalism.
Yeah.
Can that be a story?
I agree with that. I agree with that. But I also think that it is if it is a methodology going forward, it's also one based on empirical evidence. It's built on the success of that same kind of model of export-oriented transition that Singapore practiced, that South Korea practiced, that in fact is written up in models like Arthur Lewis's model of development with unlimited supply of labor. It is a model that works for some parts of the world and not for others. And so, when China, with great humility, talks about this model with Chinese characteristics, it's also a model that Lee Kuan Yew discussed with Deng Xiaoping in the late 1970s. It's a model that China learned from seeing Singapore's experience, from seeing experience of other East Asian economies. It is not an ideology axiomatic driven model, the same way that models of political democracy and liberal democracy sometimes become. So I agree with you.
Thank you, Professor. So next question is from Dongchen Han. He said, Professor Quah, may I know your view on how Singapore could further advance its economic agenda in the new Sino-US relations when Biden is bringing US back to world stage and the pandemic is not going to cease very soon?
Yeah, thank you for that. Okay, I obviously I don't speak for Singapore, far from it. I'm just an observer along with everybody else. And along with everybody else in Singapore, actually across all of Southeast Asia, we all view, the US-Sino competition with great concern. Singapore's Prime Minister has, of course, written about this in the journal Foreign Affairs, where a number of messages come across. Singapore does not, if the competition is viewed as binary, either the US or China will prevail, there must be one or the other, and everyone has to choose sides. Singapore and the rest of Southeast Asia does not want to choose sides. We are small states who like to think that we have agency in nudging the equilibrium towards better outcomes, but we do not seek to replace protagonists in this, great power confrontation, nor do we seek to ally with one side or the other. For the last 70 years, Singapore and many other Southeast Asian states have benefited from China's economic growth, the same way that we have benefited from America's technology and lessons in how America runs its system. So Singapore and all Southeast Asian nation states want to continue to be friends and get the best out of dealings with all. The Prime Minister, Singapore's Prime Minister, and others have remarked on how neither the US nor China should be asking Southeast Asian states whose side they will want to be on, no matter who is doing the asking. Because on the general principle that you don't want to ask a question that you might not like the answer to. So don't ask Southeast Asia which side is going to choose. Southeast Asia, Singapore will continue to want to draw benefits from all sides to this. There is one scenario, however, under which that choice might not be available. And that scenario turns on the reality of geography. China is in East Asia. Southeast Asia is in East Asia. This is a geographical reality. These are geographical facts. America can choose whether it wants to continue to be present in Southeast Asia. If it does, we all welcome it because it will do good things, having the American consumer, having American expertise, building better collaborations, continuing to increase trust between all peoples of the world. But if America chooses not to be in Southeast Asia any longer, that is a choice for America to make. And if America is not in Southeast Asia is going to be dealing with the rest of East Asia. Thank you for your question.
Thank you so much, Professor. And unfortunately, due to the time limits, we have to stop from here. So sorry, everyone, for that really insightful question. So before we wrap up, I would like to thank our guest, Professor Quah, again, for sharing your time with us. It is such an honor for us to have all this discussion with you, and we are incredibly thankful.
The honor is mine, CC and Jackson and everybody else who's organized this, and everybody who's asking questions. I know that CC has told me that all your questions are so insightful and so interesting to discuss. I wish we did have the time. If some point in the future I'm able to come back to London, we can travel again. I would love to be engaged with all of the members of this group.
Definitely, we will definitely be looking forward to that. And I have to say, it is a huge lesson and a long way to go on learning Sino-US relations. And also for everyone here, thank you so much for being here with us today. And we have more of such events, both virtually and offline, coming up. So make sure you follow our social media accounts, and we will see you again very soon. So thank you, guys. Have a good day.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.